Good afternoon, everyone. I am a Linux user. I'm also a Windows user. Over the years, I have switched and I'm more of a Linux user, but I still use Windows. I help teach Windows classes for our senior citizens in our area. So I dual boot, but primarily work Linux. And one of the biggest issues that pop up when people who are new to Linux take a look at it are very confused about the number of Linux that there is out there. With Windows, we have Windows. There are slight differences between the Home, the Pro, Enterprise, or Business, Ultimate, but those are just kind of features that Microsoft adds on top. But it's pretty much one Windows. And I think the Apple is pretty much, one Apple. But with Linux, if you go out and check it, you will find a number of different Linux, and it gets very confusing. And people wonder, why are there so many? And when somebody asks me that question, I reply back to them, well, why are there so many cars? And so today I'd like to be able to share a little bit of information with you as to why are there so many different Linux, and help you maybe sort through to take a look at some and find out what you like. So we're going to begin with a little history and some comparisons as to what I kind of want to be touching on. In this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about engines and kernels, the manufacturers of cars and the distributors of Linux, body styles of automobiles, and the key part of desktop environments for Linux. There's also a little slight thing we'll talk about auto parts and software packages. Moving on then to talk about test driving cars in Linux. And then finally we'll end up with making a decision as to which car or which Linux is best. And if there are questions along the way, please feel free to chat them, and between Huey and myself, we will try to answer those. If we go back and talk about cars, yes, there's been a way back history, but what I wanted to focus on was just the gas engine, because we had steam cars and horses pulling wagons, things like that. And the original players, as I look through the history books, that Siegfried Marcus back in 1870 was kind of one of the first developers of the gas engine. And then in 1886, you can see that Benz and Dahmer, which surprised me because that was Mercedes-Benz and Chrysler-Dahmer, were the ones that are really noted for inventing the gas engine that our modern day cars run on. Of course, down through the time, there are some other engines such as the steam and the diesel, electric. I even think in our area in Newark we had a natural gas dispenser for some unique cars. In the Linux world, Linux started way back with a system that was called Unix. And Richard Stallman, back in 1983, wanted to create a very open, free Linux or Unix type operating system. And he had pretty much all the parts developed like they did with cars. They had pretty much the wagon and the box shape. They just didn't have an engine to run it. And he had everything needed, except he didn't have what was called the kernel for operating his system. And in '91, there was a student, a Finnish computer college student, who was working on a project kind of like for his own personal use. And he was trying to develop the kernel, which is like the engine of Linux. And he put together something that would work, sent out some information to some of his friends, said, here's something you might be interested in taking a look at. It's just a project I've been working on. And as it went out around the world, more and more people saw it and liked it. and that became the very basis of the Linux operating system. In fact, Linus has complete control over what is included in a Linux kernel and what gets taken out. But then once beyond that, it's open for anything. Original cars, you know, when we go back and look at the original cars, I found out that I didn't know that before my favorite Oldsmobile, that the Drury Motor Wagon was one of the first gasoline cars that came out, and then the Olds and Rambler, and then Ford. Everybody thinks of Ford was the original maker, but really, the history books say that Ford was the one that designed the assembly line to make the cars come out faster. And then he had a falling out with somebody, and they moved his company, and Cadillac was born. So we have some of those original cars back then, and over the years we've had many, many more people who have decided they can make a car better than somebody else, and so we have the other brands of cars. In the Linux world, the original systems, starting back in 1993 and 4, were created by a name called Slackware and Debian and Red Hat. And those were the founding Linux or automobiles at that time. And there was a couple of other major ones. That one was Enoch that became Gentoo, and back in 2001 another Linux version came out named Arch. Over the years, there have been a number of other ones that have come and gone, just like cars that we know that have been there, Edsel, and gone, and other cars even in modern days. People design a car, it works for a while, and then it just kind of is gone. The modern players, when I look at automobiles, would be the big Detroit three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And then we've had a number of other major players, Honda, Toyota, Hyundai. And that's not the whole list, but that just gives you an idea that there are a number of players in the auto world. Along with that, we pretty much have the same automaker, or the makers in the Linux family, and that being Slackware, Debian, Red Hat, Gentoo, and Arch. As I said, there are others that have come and gone, but these are the ones that are the main building blocks. Now, I call these recipe starters because we live in a world called free and open source. And to explain this to people, I use the good old-fashioned potluck dinner where somebody brings a dish and you get this dish and it's just wonderful. And you have, let's say, a family reunion that you want to take this dish and serve it. So you ask your friend, I really like that dish. Can I take it and I have it to take to my potluck? And the person says, well, it's kind of a family secret, but you know, I'll make up a dish for you that you can take and they can enjoy it. And when you go to your family potluck and people try it, they'll say, oh boy, this is great. What's in it? You'll have to say, well, I don't really know. It just came that way. The dish was free. You didn't have to pay for it, but it wasn't open in terms of you knowing what all is inside of it. Windows is sort of that way. In Apple, we don't really know what's totally inside of them, but we can use it, and there are some programs that we use in Windows that are like that. They're free, but we really don't know what makes it up. But if this friend says, oh, sure, you can have the recipe, they give you the recipe, so therefore it's open source because you know exactly what's in it, and you can either follow the recipe and create it exactly like it is there, or you can add things to it, you know, take things out. You can say, you know, they made a good recipe, but I think it would be better if I put this in it. Or I'm taking it somewhere. I have a friend that's got a very severe nut allergy in seeds. So if I had a recipe that could, go without seeds and nuts, I could remove that so he could eat it. And so this is how Linux operates. Linux is a totally free and open source recipe where anybody can take the recipe for Linux and change it around, except for the kernel, and create whatever. And so that's what happens. Everybody says, that was a good version of Linux, but I can do one better. And somebody else says, well, I like your version and I can do it better. And that's why we end up with kind of so many different kinds of Linux, because it's free to make changes to it. Now, within automobiles, of course, we have divisions. And so General Motors has those cars of old. And we know that over time, my favorite Olds was dropped, and then my next favorite Pontiac was dropped. Ford has their 3. Chrysler used to have 3. They dropped the Plymouth. And Honda has their 2, and Toyota. And I was telling my wife that a lot of people don't realize that who Acura and Lexus is made by. You just hear those cars, but they're all divisions. So basically with General Motors, you've got the same kind of car that can be a different variation. I know that one year there was a car that I had that there were 5 different variations. Chevy made one, Pontiac, Olds, Buick, and even Cadillac made a version. If anybody remembers the Cadillac Cimarron, it was the 5th level, and each car was the same car but had all sorts of other features added to it to make it a little bit more appealing to different people. And Ford did that, but they just said we can do it in 3, and Dodge or Chrysler in 3. So we have those. Well, in the Linux world, we have the same thing. And somebody started out with Slackware, which was the original, and they said we can do it somewhat better. And they made a version called SUSE. And then that kind of became a corporate version. And so somebody said, okay, we're going to keep that recipe. We like the SUSE variation, and we're going to make it open. So we now have OpenSUSE. Debian, which is kind of like the mother of all Linux, is the one I think is the most copied and most modified. And 2 of the major players under Debian is Knoppix and Ubuntu, or Ubuntu, some people call. And there's also a 3rd one called Linux Mint. And these are all based on Debian. Debian recipe, Knoppix said, okay, we like it, but we're going to make some changes and go this little bit direction. Same with Ubuntu and, like I said, Mint. And Ubuntu even has a number of different people who have branched off of that. They said, okay, we like Ubuntu, but we're going to make a different version. And so we end up building up and getting tens of hundreds of different ones. Red Hat was the other original, and it became the more or less the business one. And Fedora, which is a word for hat, and its symbol is a red hat, became more of the free one. The RHEL is the Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is the server one. A lot of the different companies use Linux as their server operating system, and that's more of a paid one in a sense that it's supported. But it also did branch off into one that was called Mandrake, and Mandrake broke off into Mandravia, and then there are some Linuxes that are based on Mandravia, some that are based on Fedora. It just depends on whoever's creating what they like best. Same thing for Arch. They've got 2 called Chakra and Manjaro or Manjaro. And Gentoo, being the kind of the newer one, has branched off to a lot of little ones. There's no big major players that I could see in that family. Arch would be one that would be developed for somebody who really wants to put it together from scratch. It would be like saying, I'm going to order a car and I'm going to get all the parts, and I have to put it all together myself. Once you put it together, it's going to be a pretty good one. Most other Linuxes, okay, we're going to order it and it's going to come pretty much pre-made. Now, body styles is the next category, and I got this list right here from one of the rental cars agencies, just to show you that we have a lot of different styles of car shapes, all the way from the subcompact clear to the standard full, and sometimes I can't figure out what the difference between a standard and a full-size car is because they're kind of the same. But station wagons, my old days of station wagons, nowadays vans, luxury cars, and SUVs. So these are all cars. They all do the same thing. They can get you from point A to point B. It's just the size of the car you want. Maybe you want the economy of gas for subcompacts, or you want the comfort and everything of a luxury styled. You need the durability of an SUV because where you go, you're a family, you need the van. So, you know, you have a lot of different styles of car bodies, but basically all doing the same thing. In Linux, the body styles would be the equivalent of the desktop environment. That the desktop is all of the parts that you actually see. It's like your graphical user interface that we have on Windows, and it's what you use every day. And again, for the same kind of thing, we have lots of different. The original first one that came out was called KDE, K Desktop Environment, and it's gone through a number of different growths, and we're up to KDE 4 and a new version called Plasma. It's probably the one that is the more luxury one. Takes a lot of computer resources, has a lot of extra features on it. A second one that was out was called Gnome, and it's up to 3 in Gnome-shell. At the same time, people said, you know, I don't need a full, huge, fancy, lots of features. I want something that is just a basic works, doesn't take a lot of resources. So developers said, we're going to create a body that's streamlined, and that's what the XFCE is. And somebody else said, well, we're going to make one that's maybe even a little bit less resource using, and they call that the LXDE. So these are just numbers. Now the Trinity is another one that you don't hear too much about, and I'm going to show it to you. That it's an offspring of KDE. And then the same thing, we get Unity, which comes with the Ubuntu, is a branch of the Gnome-shell. Mate is a branch of the older GNOME, and Cinnamon is another variation of the Gnome-shell. We, in the Linux world, if we have people who, especially like with the XP people, who have computers that are still working, but really don't have the processor and the RAM and stuff, the XFCE and the LXDE work beautifully on them, whereas the KDE and the GNOME would maybe make it struggle some. So we have all these variations in between for whatever somebody's needs are. So what I'd like to do now is take you a walk around the showroom to give you an idea of what these different desktop environments look like, and what you're going to, maybe for those who you are new to Linux, you'll be surprised and say, well, that doesn't look anything out of normal. And you're going to find out that it's pretty well basically what all computers are, would be menus and shortcuts and windows that pop up. We're going to start with the KDE one. This is an older version of KDE. And when you look at it, you can see, oh yeah, it has a lot of what we had in the Windows world, the Apple world. I go clear back to the days when we started in the late 70s, when we had the Atari and the Commodores and the Apple, and they all kind of were their own separate, but they all had kind of like some of the same designs. So you can see here that there's a menu that pops up, just like we're used to, and side menus that pop up. windows that open up just like we do. And so this is one that would have been back more in the original days. The KDE has the little dragon as their little mascot. Gnome, one of the very earliest looking Gnome, reminds me a lot of the Windows 95 type screens. Very plain, but yet still up at the top you have a menu that drops down instead of pops up that has your applications. You have a shortcut to your file system up there. You have shortcuts on your desktop. You have windows that pop open. And so when you look at that, you'll say, okay, there's nothing strange and odd about, about Linux. One question with the dual booting, I've been dual booting for many years. You put Windows on, then you put Linux on. When the computer starts up, you have a choice. Do you want to do Windows or do you want to do Linux? And then you just click on it and do it. So no real problems with dual booting that. I've been doing it for a long time. In fact, I was triple booting one time with Windows 7, Windows 8, and Linux because I needed to have 7 and 8. If we move on, XFCE, here's that one that I said is for lighter weight. I like this one of the best because it's really snappy, and even on a newer computer, it works fine. It's not real fancy, but it has everything that you need. There's the drop-down menu. There's the shortcuts on the top. The one thing I like best about XFCE is that if I right-click anywhere on the desktop, my application menu is right there. I don't have to go back to the top corner or the bottom. It's always with the mouse, right mouse click. So that's XFCE has everything, but it runs very well on older computers. The LXDE, same thing. It's the same kind of Windows. It just doesn't have a lot of extra stuff that you might not necessarily need, but it still has a button in the bottom that pops up your applications. It still can have shortcuts on your taskbar. You've got your clock in the bottom. You've got shortcuts on the screen. Really no big difference on that, other than it doesn't take a lot of resources. It can run on low RAM like XP used to do, and a low processor. But if you run it on a newer machine, it's lightning. Now, as people wanted to change things, here's a newer version of KDE, and you can see that they kept pretty much with the same style. You got your buttons at the bottom, your shortcuts. What's different about Windows or Linux from a long time ago, Linux allows you to have multiple workspaces. And you can see on this one, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 down at the bottom. I can have 4 different giant windows that I can switch, and I can have one thing running in one window, switch to another. This would be like in the days before dual monitoring, that I can have up to 4 different windows or screens, and I can be running different things. So rather than have to have something covering up another thing, when you have multiple windows, you just have multiple workstations. And in some of the versions of Linux, you can have 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 20 different workstations if you needed something like that. Just jumping up to keep questions on the dual booting, it is separate partitions, or it can be separate hard drives. Linux doesn't care about that. You can put Windows on one hard drive, and then you can put Linux on a second hard drive, and you still get the same menu that pops up and says, what do you want to use, Linux or Windows? Or you can do it on partitions. I do it where I put them on partitions for the operating system, but then I use a separate hard drive for data, which is a lot of what most of us computer people try to keep the data off. And so that way, the data is on one. The reason I do that, it's because Linux can read Windows data. So I can put all of my data on one drive, and if I'm in Windows, I can read it. If I'm Linux, I can read it. So that's why I do it that way. So you can see that the KDE on this screen looks a little bit more modern. You know, we're getting into, you know, Windows XP as opposed to the 95, 98. And the same thing happened for GNOME. It moved and got a little bit nicer looking, and that's just because somebody smoothed out some of the lines. XFC even did that, but they still kept the same basic idea of keeping it low powered so that older computers can use it. But like I said, I like this one because it runs so fast on a more powerful computer, and it has all the stuff that I need. Here's a more modern LXDE. They're saying just because you have an old computer that doesn't have the resources and the RAM doesn't mean you don't have to have a computer that doesn't look new and modern. So this one is great. Long-term support, so questions popped up. It depends on the company you're doing. Number of the ones that I use, they have long-term support that's usually 5 years. So that once a version comes out, it's going to be supported for 5 years, and then there will be a new version. But at the same time, they have their kind of fast track where they will have a new version that's coming out every 9 months, or used to be, or every 6 months, or every year. And so people can get new ones often. But people who like to say, you know, I like long-term, you can get one that goes for 5 years. And then after 5 years, change. The advantage is you can change whenever you want to because it's not going to cost you anything to change. And people with cars do that. You know, we know many people who lease a car for 1 or 2 years, and then they get a new one. They always want to have, the, you know, the newest. And some of the Linux people do the same thing. You know, they upgrade every 6 months, every 9 months. Ubuntu comes out with a new one every 6 months. And so somebody could get the newest and greatest every 6 months. But other people say, I want long term. So then all of a sudden, as we grow over, KDE decided to really take the step into being modern. And they came out with a whole new look, including small windows on top of your desktop that includes these folders. And there's all sorts of these different little widgets that can be on here. A whole new menu style, as you can see on the bottom left. You can go to a favorites tab, then your applications. Under applications, it's in categories. And then you click on the category and you see all the things like that. This one takes a lot of resources, and so you can't really run this one very well on an old computer because it's going to take a lot. And it's got a lot of stuff on there. I got kind of upset the other night. I was trying to change the background, and I couldn't find how to change it. I had to go on the web, and it finally said you change the background of the desktop by going into the folder setup. I said, wow, that was kind of, you know, hard to get to. So they moved and made it real modern looking. Well, the Trinity one said, you know, we got a lot of people who don't like that flashy. And so Trinity says we're going to stick with the KDE 3 version, and they're maintaining that today. So being free and open source, you can do that. So they took the KDE 3 and said we're going to modify it, call it our name, and they're keeping that going so that anybody who is using a KDE type operating system can have an alternate desktop by using Trinity. GNOME, to keep up with the more modern KDE, came up with a whole new thing. They call them Gnome-shell. And in this one, you have one button at the top that clicks on and brings up activities, which is the bar that's down the side. And then down at the very bottom, you see the 9 little buttons. You click that and you get all of your programs, and you just scroll through them. What they've added is that there's a box at the top that you can just type what you're looking for. And so GNOME says we're coming with a whole new way, kind of maybe competing with the KDE group. And a lot of people like that, but again, this kind of a look takes quite a lot of resources again. Well, the people who said we don't like that new GNOME, a different group of developers said we want to continue with the GNOME 2, and so they have created what they call Mate, or some people call it Mate, and it's a very good desktop that doesn't do the fancy, but it has more modern look. You can see this one has a pop-up menu where you've got your places and your system on the left side, then you have your applications in the middle, and then the the categories, then the actual one on the side. And this one is a very modern one. It's new. It just had a recent version. But it sticks to the GNOME 2 without going to that new Plasma type. Ubuntu said, well, we don't really like the Gnome-shell, but we don't want to stay back with the old GNOME, so we're going to come up with our own desktop environment, and we're going to call it Unity. And what they've done is they have a taskbar that pops out from the side with all their shortcuts. And what's nice about this one is that this is like a Rolodex. I can put twice as many of those icons on that left side, and all I have to do is move my mouse down to the bottom, and it just rolls around like a Rolodex, for those people who know what a Rolodex is. But when you click on the button that they have at the top called their dash, it will bring up this kind of a modern looking window that has your most recently used and all of your programs. There's a way that if you click, you can get it filtered by categories, but their big claim is that all you do is start typing at the top. Like if I wanted to use Firefox, all I'd have to do would be to start typing FI, and only things that begin with FI would show up, and there would be Firefox. Click on it, and away I go. There is not an easy way to put anything on the taskbar across the top because you have it all on the bottom. Some people said, well, we don't like that. So a group of developers who have the Cinnamon said, okay, we're going to take that newer Gnome-shell, modern technology, but we're going to keep it in the looks of the old. So this looks very similar to Mate, and you can see that they have shortcuts down the side. They don't have the places. I kind of like that on the Mate window menu because you can see easily where you can go to your different homes, and they have the categories in the middle and your programs on the side. You can also put shortcuts down at the bottom on the taskbar. The taskbar can be at the bottom of the screen or at the top. I like mine dropping down. That just can be moved. And so you have the Gnome-shell that goes that way. So you have all these different versions because people are different. Here's an example of those same operating systems, or the developers for the different versions of Linux. And you can see that many of them now are offering their version in a number of different desktops. So Debian, the original, is now offered in 4 different, the KDE, the GNOME, XFCE, and the LDE. Ubuntu has the XX under GNOME because they changed that GNOME into their Unity. But within their family, somebody said, you know, we really don't like the Unity, so we're going to go back and we're going to make a version of the Gnome-shell. So there is another new version of Ubuntu in their family that's called Gubuntu, or Gubuntu, that has the regular Gnome-shell. So they have a minimum of 5 versions. Linux Mint said they kind of like what Ubuntu is doing, which is based off of Debian, but we can do it one little better. So we have a third level for Linux Mint, and they're the ones that came out with the Mate and Cinnamon. However, they know how much people like the KDE for all of its full features, and they know how people like the XFCE for its low resources, so now they have 4 versions. Linux Mint also has a branch that's based directly on Debian. They said, why branch it off of Ubuntu, which is branched off of Debian, and they have it just with the Mate and the Cinnamon. So another company said, oh, since they don't have the KDE or the XFCE, we'll make a version. So the solid XK would be very similar to the LMDE. So one group does 2 desktops and one group does the other. You can see Fedora, that was from the original Red Hat, all 5 versions because they know it. And other ones have their choice. So what I'm saying here is that after you've gone through the showroom and you finally decided what desktop version you like the best, then you can easily find a variation of Linux that sports your desktop and have a pick. So if I like the XFCE, you can see right here there are 6 different versions of Linux that I could pick that all have the same pretty much look. They just kind of work in the background a little bit different. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about building parts because there's another factor of Linux. If I was building a car in the old days, since I'm not a builder of cars, General Motors always recommended the AC Delco parts, and Ford had the Motorcraft, and Chrysler had Mopar. So if I was building or upgrading or whatever, I kind of had to go along with those. Since I don't do the building and stuff, I just take my car to the garage and say, fix it. That's not an issue to me. They take care of that and make sure the right parts go into the car. Same thing works with Linux. Each of these different families are different because of the package manager that they use, what they use to build the programs inside their operating systems. So for example, Slackware uses Slack package, which is different than the Debian package, the RPM, Red Hat package manager, Pac-Man, Portage. These are all different ways that you would build up the programs. Remember I said it's open source, you build, put it together. All I ever do is say, okay, I'm using Debian, I go out and get a Debian version of a program. And I don't even have to worry about putting together, I just get it. So that if I'm not actually building it up like a programmer would, even that doesn't matter to me. And so you have those options. Now we go to the best part. Oh, yeah, add-ons. This has changed over the years, but I can remember that as I grew up and my parents got cars, add-ons were big. AC was an add-on, power windows, cruise control, all those. Nowadays, more and more of those are features that come with your car. But in the old days, car add-ons usually added on costs to your vehicle. And so sometimes when you were buying a car and you only had so much money, you had to decide which feature was the best for those. Oh yeah, thanks Jackie, because the Zorin is great. I could fool people. I could get a desktop Zorin, put it in front of somebody, and they would think they were using Windows, wouldn't even know they were using Linux. With Linux, though, whenever you install Linux, it pretty much comes with everything you need. There's almost nothing that you're missing. So just about anything you want, you can have on there. You can go to a store because there's alternatives. As we know that there's different web browsers that you can get. Each Linux comes with a web browser, a word processing, a photo program. just comes already packed in it. But I can go out and get whatever I want, and almost 95% of the time it doesn't cost anything. There are programs that I can buy for Linux if I wanted to, but FreeJohn doesn't do that very often. So that's a real advantage, is that you can build it, and the more things you add isn't going to add anything to the cost of Linux. Finally, as you've been to the car place and you finally kind of decide you're focusing on a couple cars, you can take them for test drives. But a lot of times there's limits. The worst one is the salesman has to ride with you, so that he hears everything you talk about and kind of makes sure you don't go test it this way and test it whatever. And usually you take it out for a little drive and you come back. I can remember a lot of times in the old days you could take it out for about a 10 or 15 minute drive, and then you're going, well, I didn't really get to drive it on all the places. And then some dealers will be nice enough, take it out and take it home for the night. Drive around for wherever you want to. But you have your limits. With Linux, it's free. And most Linux operating systems will fit on a CD or DVD that you can burn, and you just throw it in your computer and boot to it, and you run it. And you can test it out. Doesn't do anything to your computer, doesn't make any changes, and you can try it out as long as you want. No limitations. And you can try out as many as you want. I have a feeling that sometimes if you can't quite decide on a car, that the salesperson might get kind of tired if you would have tried 4, 5, 6 different cars driving and test driving. But with Linux, you can try out as many different ones as you want. I encourage people to try out all those different desktops and see which ones you like. So that's the great part about Linux, is that it doesn't cost you a thing. You can try out. They have 32-bit versions, 64-bit versions, and you can try them out. You can also do it where you can create a virtual machine, which is another whole project, and run them virtually inside your Windows to try them out. And then if you decide that you want to try it out and you still want to keep Windows, you can dual boot. No big deal. Our computer club just had a build your own workshop, and we had a couple people that built a computer and put Windows on. We had a couple people built a computer, put Linux on, and we had some that dual booted, put Windows and Linux on. And then I had one person that built a computer with Linux and put Windows virtually inside of it. So it works very, very good. So now we finally come to the question, what's the best? What's the best car? What's the best Linux? The answer is it's whichever one meets your needs. And that's why we have so many cars, because we all have different needs. That's why we have so many different Linuxes, because we all have different needs. If you'd like to do your personal test drive, on the sheet here, I have listed some of the major Linux distributions where you can go and you can download the ISO and then burn it to a CD, not copy it, burn it. But the best place to go is this Distro Watch, because they have almost 100 different Linuxes listed that you can click on, read some reviews, see some screenshots, and then even download and try it out. And I think it's the best thing. As FreeJohn, my slogan is, try it, try the free one. You might like it. And if it doesn't meet your needs, then go out and buy whatever thing you need. If you have any questions or would like to share any information with me about Linux, you can get me at lccs.freejohn at my gmail.com address. I think we still have a few minutes for questions, if people have questions or comments. I would strongly say give a try. If you know somebody who's still hanging on to an XP and they're concerned about that, and they, a lot of our senior citizens in our group, the idea of having to buy a new computer and new operating system money-wise is kind of hard. This gives them a chance. The compatibility with Windows programs. There are a number of Windows programs that will run on a third-party program called Wine that's a free or crossover, and then you can run it on there. But not everyone, because sometimes Windows programs are kind of designed that they don't want to run on anything but Windows. For me, it's not an issue because there are thousands of programs out there. I can just about find any program that I would need in a Linux format. I've been using cross-platform programs for years, like LibreOffice or OpenOffice that works on Windows, Linux, and Mac. We know all of our browsers are that way. So I can find just about, but there are some programs. A lot of people ask about the games. More and more games are coming to Linux through the Steam. I'm not a gamer, so I'm not the expert on that. The suggestion, distro closest to Windows, one of them would be the Zorin, and the other one that is getting to be real popular is called LXLE. It's the LXDE desktop, but been modernized, so it's an LXLE, and it looks very close to Windows with all the features. But Zorin's a good one. I even think that the any of the XFC ones are very close to XP where they pop out. And what's nice is, again, Linux is free. You can try a number of different ones until you find one that fits you. Anybody else have any kind of questions? I'm hoping that this will start a future of virtual technology conferences that does include different workshops on Linux to be able to share what we have on there. Okay, the 512 megs, yeah, almost anything that runs the XFCE or the LXDE will probably run on the 512 megs. Some of them are designed for more. Probably sticking with the 32-bit version instead of the 64 will also make it work better. Like I said, go to that distro watch and then take some views on that and see some of those, and they'll show you what they look like, and you can find the ones that look like it, then download them, try them out for free, and see which ones really work best.